Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is May 13th, 2011, and my guest is William Easterly of New York University. Bill, welcome back to EconTalk.
Hey, Russ.
Our topic for today is a recent paper, very provocative paper you've written called Benevolent Autocrats. What is a benevolent autocrat, and what does it have to do with economic growth?
A benevolent autocrat is any leader in a non-democratic society that gets the credit for high economic growth. So I'm thinking like the Lee Kuan Yew, who gets the credit for the Singapore miracle, or Park Chung-hee, who gets the credit for South Korea's high growth and the Korean miracle.
And there's China.
Yeah, now everyone's favorite example
there's
is
so many.
China. Even to the extent that people are starting to talk about a Beijing consensus replacing the Washington consensus, in which authoritarian high growth would be the kind of model to follow.
The Washington consensus was the idea that property rights, rule of law, open markets yield growth, and now we have another view that says that autocrats yield growth, I guess would be the polite way to say it.
Right. Autocrats advised by experts yield growth.
Yeah. Well, your paper opens with a rather remarkable quote, which I'm afraid I've seen before, but it bears repeating. A quote from New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman saying, "One-party autocracy certainly has its drawbacks, but when it is led by a reasonably enlightened group of people, as China is today, it can also have great advantages. That one party can just impose the politically difficult but critically important policies needed to move a society forward in the 21st century." Now, what's your reaction to that?
Well, Tom Friedman is almost too good to be true. He's like the perfect caricature of the arrogant intellectual who thinks that his ideas are the key to the success of the society that he is living in. And the reason he likes autocrats so much is that they have no political constraints on following the advice of brilliant intellectuals like Tom Friedman.
In theory, right? In theory, they have no constraints. One of the
right. That's one of the things I'm going to examine in the paper, actually. But in the sort of fantasy version of the benevolent autocrat, they have no constraints. They can do whatever they want, and if they follow the advice of the great experts and the intellectual elite, personified by Tom Friedman, then they can do all the great things to move a society forward into the 21st century.
We'll talk about the probability that that's true, but I have to mention my favorite part of the quote. Well, it's probably that he spelled lead correctly. A lot of people I've noticed spell it L-E-A-D like the metal, but he correctly spelled it L-E-D. But the part that I find most striking is the first sentence, which is said in a certain, I don't know what kind of smoking jacket tone. One-party autocracy certainly has its drawbacks. Yes, it does.
Right.
Concentration camps, the gulag, those would be two.
Famines that kill 10 million people.
That's unbelievable.
Yes. Some drawbacks, yes.
I don't understand. That fascinates me.
Yeah.
And then the next part is also worth noting. But when it is led by a reasonably enlightened group of people, as China is today, you could say as China appears to be. I mean, I have no intimate knowledge, and I don't even think Thomas Friedman has intimate knowledge. And I assume of the relative enlightenment of the Chinese leaders, I assume he's drawing the conclusion that they're enlightened from the fact that they are following green policies, which is what the rest of the quote goes on to talk about: wind power and solar power, electric things, and
right. Although he's also just praised them for wise economic policy in general, as many others have, of course. Yeah.
So let's return now that we've spent a good 4 minutes on Thomas Friedman. I wish we could spend the whole podcast on that quote. But let's cast a wider net. He's not alone. There's, as you beautifully summarized in the paper, it's a widely espoused or at least considered view by academics, pundits, and others. So what are some of the other views that are similar to Friedman's?
Well, I thought I give a number of quotes from all kinds of sources, but I thought one of the most sort of possibly representative quote was from a group that came together to produce something called the World Bank Growth Commission Report. The World Bank spent $4 million to sort of get all the collected wisdom of literally like 200 academics and other think tank types to give their views on what causes growth, what to do to raise growth. And $4 million turned out to be a pretty high price tag for reaching almost no conclusions whatsoever on how to achieve high growth. But
they didn't ask enough people, Bill. They only had 200. It's like some people say you need the S&P 500. Why not have the Dow Jones to balance your portfolio? But some say the S&P 500. But what about the Russell 1000? They only had 200, but they did the best they could.
They did the best they could, yeah. So, they have these remarkably wishy-washy quotes like, whatever causes growth to go up today may not cause it to go up tomorrow, and things like that. But the one thing that they did seem to feel was a very strong consensus conclusion was, and here's the exact quote, was the statement that growth at such a quick pace, meaning 7% GDP growth, which would be about 5% per capita growth, incredibly high growth, over such a long period, they were talking about periods of 25 years or more, requires strong political leadership.
Which is euphemism.
Then I sort of decoded that in fact, if you look at their actual examples, all of them except Japan were autocrats. So that was their euphemism for benevolent autocrats, was strong political leadership.
Now, by the way, the word benevolent is somewhat uncertain in these cases, right? But it is certainly true that many of the most dramatic examples of high growth rates, as you chronicle in the paper, are from undemocratic states that are autocratic, correct?
Right. Correct.
Singapore, China, Korea, South Korea.
Right. Right.
And a handful of others. Japan would be an exception.
Right.
A democracy that managed to sustain high growth for a while.
Right.
I say a while, not a long time, but maybe it is a long time, you could say.
Right.
So that looks pretty convincing. All the winners are autocrats.
Right.
What's your response to that?
Well, this taps into another thing the paper talks about a lot, which is that unfortunately all of us have these what are called by the unlovely name of cognitive biases, that we have ways of thinking about evidence that leads us systematically to misunderstand the way the evidence points. And this statement this fact that you were just describing is a classic case that we notice. If you're a success, you're an autocrat. So the secret to success must be to be an autocrat.
Seems logical.
But that was asking the question the wrong way around. We don't want to know what is the probability you're an autocrat if you're a success. We want to know what is the probability that if you are an autocrat, you will be a success.
Which are not the same thing, but they're
which
so close. They seem like the same thing to our...
totally the reverse. So if you're an autocrat, you have not only the great successes of the Lee Kuan Yew's, but now you have to factor in the Mobutus and the Mugabes and
North Korea, not just
North
South
Korea, and and that is once you stop to think about it for 10 seconds, you realize that is the correct probability, of course, that we need to know. What is the chance of success if you are an autocrat? And yet there's this systematic tendency that all the psychologists and behavioral economics literature have documented over and over again that we mix up these probabilities. And we just simply mix them up. We think that the first probability that most of the most of the successes are autocrats, that we think that implies that most autocrats are successes. Of course, it does not at all.
Yeah, and as much as I'm as proud as I am of this program and the many things I hope listeners have learned, this may be the single most valuable thing that you learn from this entire program, not just this hour, but all of them. It is, for example, in the book you have a table, and if you approach the table nakedly and just look at it, you could easily make the mistake again. But I'm going to try to rephrase. I'm going to help the reader read the table, which is easy because the table is not visible. So here's the way I understood it, and you can tell me if I have it right. 9 out of 10 of the extraordinary growth stories of the past 40 or 50 years have been autocracies.
Right.
So you think, well, 9 out of 10? Wow. Well, obviously, autocracy has a lot to do with growth.
Right.
But it turns out, of the, how many countries are we talking about? How many? This is another
126.
Yeah. So of the 100 and how many of them are?
I'm sorry, 124.
How many of those are autocracies?
Autocracies are 89.
So there's 89 autocracies. Only 9 of them are successful. So you're fooled into thinking that because turns out growing really fast is hard to do.
Right.
Now you might then at least say, well, okay, being an autocrat doesn't lead to growth, but the only way you could get high growth is to be an autocracy. And that would be a legitimate possibility.
Right.
Doesn't mean it's true. Doesn't mean it raises your chances even, because you need to know how many democracies there are. And very hard to keep those two things straight. It's fantastically interesting.
Right.
Statistics.
So then the rest of the paper goes on to demolish that possibility.
Yeah, so let's talk about that.
Yeah.
So one view would be, for those of us who are anti-autocratic and are skeptical of this romance about autocracy, we have to face the fact that somehow, even though the odds are small that being an autocracy can lead to high rates of growth, it did happen 9 times out of the 80 whatever, and that's surprisingly large. How did they manage to do it?
Right. So there's several ways we can think about this. So the first thing that is obviously going on here is just that the variance of growth outcomes under autocracy is much higher than it is under democracy. So if you're a mature democracy, then you're pretty much guaranteed that you're going to have a growth rate that's pretty close to 2% per capita every year, year in and year out, with pretty small variation around that average of 2% per capita year in and year out. If you're in an autocracy, then the variance is much more wide open. You could be at minus 2%, you could be at plus 6%, and so that's how you get the fact that most of the high growth is under autocracy, because you're picking off that high end of an extremely variable, distribution, or to put it in much more instinctive terms. Basically, you can think of autocracy as this very risky bet. It's sort of like, take all your life savings to Las Vegas and bet it on black on the roulette wheel, and you could get very, very rich, or you could get completely, penniless after that bet.
Not sure
that's what autocracy could be like.
Well, it's more like putting it all on one. On the roulette wheel, or 17, because black is at least 50-50.
Right.
It is. It's not quite 50-50, is it?
not in Las Vegas, but
no. I meant in autocracies, in growth outcomes. Many of the high, as we've said, many of the high growth outcomes are autocracies, and many of the utterly disastrous outcomes are autocracies. Are the utterly disastrous ones roughly, I don't remember in the table, is it roughly equally numerous or much more numerous?
The big disaster, well, I actually defined kind of catastrophe in a way that you have roughly the same number of big catastrophes as you do big successes. So that would be, it turned out to be kind of less than minus 0.5% per year decline. So, basically sharp negative growth declines are about as likely as big successes are. So that's where you're gambling. But then the next question is, is it correct to attribute the high variance to these good and bad leaders? And that's been the question that's the key question that has been left unanswered in this debate up to now. So all that we've talked about up to now was already well known, at least within the economics field. But where I'm trying to push the debate forward is on this last question: were we really justified in attributing high and low growth to the good and bad leaders under autocracy?
Because then, if it's just random, then it's random. But if it's not random, then you just say, well, we look at what the dumb ones did, and we don't do that. And we look at what the smart ones did, and we do that. And then we could have autocracy as a path to growth.
Right.
And how does that work out?
Well, I mean, we're much more likely to be favorable to the concept of a benevolent autocrat if we do recognize that at least, some successes, these 9 great success stories that are hugely stuck in our minds. If we do give the credit to the autocrats for them, then we are gonna wind up having this fairly rosy view of at least the possibility of benevolent autocrats. But what this paper is arguing is that there's really no evidence they even get the credit for that, and
that they should get the credit.
That they should get the credit for the high growth, and it looks at that several different ways. First, it turns out that this really high variance of growth under autocracy is actually not between leaders. It's not explained by, having high growth under some autocratic leaders and low growth under other autocratic leaders. That most of the variance, the high variance of growth, is actually variance within the terms of long-serving autocratic leaders. And so that really goes against the idea that leaders, I mean, this is getting a little wonky, I admit.
That's all right. But
this is serious evidence that it's not the idea that the high variance was due to the leaders. Then we would expect, there would be some good ones that get the credit for the high growth. So we would expect, the variance would mostly be driven by the difference between the good leaders and the bad leaders. And so if we just sort of calculate the averages for each leader, then the variance of high variance of growth under autocracy is just going to correspond to the high variance of leader growth averages under autocracy. But it doesn't. It turns out that most of the there isn't that much systematic difference between autocratic leaders. And most of the variance is happening within the terms of leaders. In other words, leaders are starting out good and then going bad, or they're starting out bad and then going good, or, good in the middle, bad on either end. There's all kinds of these other patterns. And now it gets harder and harder to say it was really the leader that explains the good or bad outcome. If growth is kind of fluctuating wildly during their term in office, and on what basis do we attribute the growth to their term in office?
Well, you could argue that they start off stupid, but they get smart. They tried the steel smelter in everybody's backyard, or whatever. What's the word I want? Right. The steel foundry in everybody's backyard. That turns out to be a bad idea. You stop it. You try something different, and then when you hit on the right thing, you get your legs under you, and then you can just go forward. Is that in the data?
Right. Well, no. I mean, that's essentially what a lot of the benevolent autocrat ideas sometimes, when sort of all else fails, people will fall back on just purely circular reasoning, that they'll say, I'm sorry, I just insist on believing in benevolent and autocrats, and, any high growth that occurs, I'm going to give to them, and any negative growth that occurs during their term, that was their learning period. And, it's just, the hypothesis becomes so infinitely flexible that it just has boiled down to pure circular reasoning.
But it could be true.
I assume they're benevolent because growth is high. I explain high growth because they're benevolent. It's just totally circular.
But it could be true, right? It could be true that,
that
we're handicapped in the United States by this foolish two-term limitation.
All of this could be true. And, to be... I certainly wanted to go into this paper admitting the possibility that it could be true and giving the benevolent autocrat hypothesis a fair shake.
And how'd that turn out? Do you think you?
I'm convinced by the end of the paper that there's no theory or evidence to support benevolent autocrats. But the part about cognitive biases kind of has the prediction that we're so wedded to these concepts that no matter how much logical argument I throw at you, you're still going to believe in benevolent autocrats. That's a kind of ironic feature of this whole debate is that saying that cognitive biases help explain why we do believe in benevolent autocrats, and there are many others like some version of kind of like the Hollywood stereotypical story that we just like to attribute great events to great personalities. And that's called leadership attribution bias. And that we like to have a hero, things like that cause us to believe in benevolent autocrats. So these biases are so strong that the prediction of this paper is that this paper, which shows you that benevolent autocrats are false, also predicts that you will continue to believe they are true.
Yeah. There's an amazing line in the paper where you note that over 140, I think it was a 142 or 145, 140-something factors have been found significant in different growth models.
Right, 145, yes.
So that's sobering right there.
Yes. So how do the benevolent autocrats actually know how to raise growth when the economists are having such a hard time?
One of the conclusions of the paper one way to summarize the conclusion of the paper is that since economists, and the Growth Commission you referenced earlier would be one example of it, and you could obviously look more widely, since economists struggle to systematically understand what causes growth, it's hard to believe that a benevolent autocrat would be able to implement growth intentionally. Right. What do you think your opponents would say? Your intellectual opponents, the people who did some of those regressions, found some of those 145 factors, and would happily pass that on to an autocrat and say, I found the right recipe, or who would say that some autocrats just have a feel for it, and you want to try to find one of those. It's
right. Well, again, at some point the story becomes sort of circular and non-falsifiable, right? That if you have your favorite autocrat who's presided over high growth, then that one episode has many, many different explanations, and it's basically impossible to prove on the basis of one episode what caused it or did not cause it. And so if someone's really wedded to that concept, it's impossible to disprove it for one episode. All we can do is look at the whole pattern of the evidence. The other important pattern in the evidence that I wanted to highlight in the paper is that the good and bad growth rates that happen under autocracy, we also have to take into account that autocracy is very strongly associated with lots of other features of economies that also predict extremely variable outcomes.
For example?
So autocracies are usually commodity producers. They're usually oil producers. I'm saying some of the commodity producers are oil producers. Mm-hmm. And so to take oil producers, for example, not only are oil prices incredibly volatile, even output of oil producers is incredibly volatile. So some of our highest growth rates are oil producers, and other oil producers have catastrophically negative growth rates. And then there's lots of other features that are correlated with autocracy, like low financial development, lack of diversification of the economy. These are mostly agricultural, low-income economies with no financial ability to diversify risk. So you have, an oscillation between, booms with good harvests and good times, and catastrophic busts with bad times, and no financial ability to hedge risk. And then, these are also economies that are prone to political earthquakes like civil wars. and civil wars. If you had a civil war early in the period we're considering, and then you sort of destroy the economy, and then there's rapid reconstruction after the war, that predicts high growth. Or if the Civil War happened in the latter half of the period and destroyed a previously prosperous economy, that predicts low growth. So, autocracy is this big fact that autocracies have very, very good outcomes or very, very bad outcomes. That's really concealing the fact that autocracy is just standing in for low-income economies with lots of other features that also predict very variable outcomes.
Yeah, I'd like to look a little more at the high end, though. And I obviously, as you point out, I'll quote Hayek in the Fight of the Century rap video when he talks about the question whether whether World War II cured the Great Depression. And he says, wow, one data point, and you're jumping for joy. There is a tendency to take one data point that could be very unrepresentative. It's an outlier. It's fluky. It's got other factors that are the true causes, as you point out. But it is fascinating to me that China is thriving as much as it is, and I wonder if we could dig a little deeper into that. In particular, there are, to me, a couple issues that I think even the defenders of Chinese economic policy have to look at. And as you point out, a lot of people claim successes as their own, regardless of their ideology. So market-oriented folks will say China's growing because they're liberalizing. Friends of autocrats will say China's growing because they steer the economy from the top down, or they play with their currency or whatever's their favorite policy du jour. But it is interesting that China appears to be growing. So the first question, I would ask two questions, and see if you have any thoughts on these. One is that growth real in the sense that is it true growth? And by that, we have an enormous migration of people from the countryside to the city where previous economic activity was outside the market, and now it's going to be measured by the market if they're measuring it accurately or as best they can. So you'd expect there to be strong measured growth, even if the actual growth is smaller, because we've ignored the lost home production that isn't counted officially.
Right.
That'd be one issue. Right. You also have the issue that when you migrate from countryside to city, you have increased the chances for specialization that has nothing to do with governance from the top or the bottom. And then the next question would be, is it sustainable?
Yeah.
Is it really plausible that they're, quote, steering things masterfully, given that they might have an utter collapse any day now?
Right.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, those are two very important questions. So the first one, this is another thing that I think undermines the benevolent autocrat idea, is that another characteristic of autocratic low-income economies is that they have statistical departments that are either incompetent or dishonest.
Yeah, corrupt. Yeah.
And so you would expect that statistical departments that are very bad at measuring things are going to have very noisy growth rates. And to make it more pointed, in the case of China, there's obvious political incentives to exaggerate the measured growth rate. So, I don't think, and from what, I'm not a China hand myself, but from those I've talked to, I understand there is a strong camp arguing that Chinese growth is exaggerated, that there is some fudging going on, exaggerating Chinese growth. And remember, it's not hard to fudge the growth because there's still a large non-market part of the economy where we have no idea what the stuff being produced is worth as far as fair market value.
Yeah, is there still? I'm not a China hand either. I will.
Yeah, there's still state-owned enterprises that are still producing a lot of stuff. And,
I think they're building a lot of
things
too.
And there's still a lot of investment.
Yeah.
That may just be crap, so it may just be the growth of crap.
Yeah, but they're put into the books at high value, and therefore it looks like growth.
Right. Now, I do not believe that explains all of the Chinese miracle and the rapid growth. That would be going too far.
Yeah.
So there is really something going on there. But then that and what is going on? Well, like you said, there's lots of different stories you could tell. I mean, I think it's fairly straightforward case of change, that you had a movement from this totalitarian, destructive government, which itself was following decades of political chaos in China. And then you switch to a government that, even if you don't give it any credit for doing anything positive, at the least stopped being horribly destructive. And then you combine that with, this remarkable overseas Chinese diaspora that has showed the potential of the Chinese to participate in world trade and achieve huge gains by taking advantage of the high demand being produced by those democratic market economies to sell them things. And I think it's just a change of story. You go from a psychotic, horrible, negative government to one that is just not so psychotic and negative, and that gives you high positive growth and the opportunity to participate in world markets. And then, on the last point you mentioned, is the growth sustainable? So this is the most underappreciated and yet one of the most robust facts in all of empirical growth economics, is that growth miracles never last. They will last for a while. Some of them will last longer than we expect, but in general, they don't last. Most of them don't last very long at all. Most of them only last 5 years or 7 years. A very few last, 25 years, like China's has now. But all of the studies suggest that growth is a process that you can get a string of high growth for a while, but it just doesn't last. There's very strong what we call mean reversion in growth rates, that those countries that are above the world average, are going to move back to the world average sooner or later. And that's an overwhelming statistical tendency in the data that's been documented by every study we have. So that, think of all the previous growth miracles. Do you remember the Brazilian miracle that happened from 1967 to about 1975, when Brazil was growing at 10% per year? Who remembers the Ivorian miracle? Now Ivory Coast is everyone's favorite byword for a basket case. But, in the 60s and 70s, Ivory Coast was a booming economy and created this gleaming, city, Abidjan, full of, gleaming skyscrapers, just like Shanghai. Well, perhaps not just like Shanghai, but just, sort of analogous to Shanghai for the 60s and 70s. And, whatever happened to the Ivorian miracle? Well, very, very sad and tragic things happened to the Ivorian miracle. I'm not necessarily predicting that for China, but the point is that the overwhelming evidence is that miracles don't last. That at the very least, you go back towards average growth. Back to all the China's predecessors as East Asian tigers have already gone back to sort of average world growth.
Yeah, when you were talking about Brazil and Ivory Coast, I'm thinking about Japan, which is the big attractive story of my youth, which was, Japan's growing. They're growing faster than us. They must be doing something wise that we're not doing. What is that? It's the government business cooperation. We should emulate them. We could be like them. And
exactly. All the same sort of hysterical things now being said about China were being said about Japan, right up to the very last moment in the period around 1990, when suddenly Japan stopped growing and reverted to being a very mediocre growth rate, and has stayed at that ever since.
Yeah, they're struggling, and we're struggling too. We may struggle for a while. It's very hard to know, obviously. Yeah, well,
that's it's sort of a tragic fact of the history of studying economic development, is that we give sort of way too much importance to very small amounts of data. So it had a huge impact on the history of development economics, for example, that in its formative years in the 30s and 40s, what everyone remembered was the rapid growth of the Soviets under the 5-year plans and the Great Depression and the market economies. And so development started off being much more about Soviet central planning than it was about market economics. And something like that in a much tamer, less severe version is going on now with the crisis and coming out of the crisis and the market economies in the West and China's rapid growth.
Yeah, it is let's talk a little bit about the cognitive bias. It reminds me a little bit of the neighbor who either runs up an enormous credit card bill or maybe he's embezzling money from his firm, but all of a sudden he's putting an addition on his house and he's got a nicer car, and you look at your life and you think, well, boy, I got to be more like him, without thinking about what that means.
Right.
But it looks good. Hey, his car's bigger than mine, or his house is nicer than mine.
Right. And we have another world of experience which somehow we're able to treat more sensibly than we are economics, which is sports. If a player starts off the year hitting 500 or even 400, which many players do early in the year because the baseball season, of course, I'm talking about. If you've only had 20 at-bats, then, of course, in a small sample of 20 at-bats, a few players are going to get 10 hits out of 20 at-bats, but nobody could sustain that for the whole course of the season, and we know that. We don't expect anyone to finish up the season batting 500, and yet, that somehow we're not able to appreciate that same principle at work in economic growth, that if you take a very small number of observations, yes, some countries are going to be able to record a remarkably high growth rate average over 7 years. They'll be able to record 10% GDP growth over 7 years. But we don't expect anyone's going to grow for 100 years at 10% GDP growth. It should be exactly analogous to the baseball hitter hitting 500 after 20 at-bats. And yet somehow we fail to draw that analogy. We get it right in sports, and we can't get it right in something that matters a lot more, which is economic growth.
Well, I think we don't. I think we have the same problem in sports, actually. I think the problem we have in sports is we look at the coach who has the coach of the Redskins now, Mike Shanahan. He's got 2 Super Bowl rings. He also had a quarterback named Elway who was really good. Without Elway, he hasn't won any. So was he the genius? Was it Elway? He's tough. Yeah. He's a disciplinarian. So people say, that's what we need. Yeah, Look how it worked. It worked in Denver, and then all of a sudden it's not working. What's different? And the answer is, well, he's got different players. But we attribute so much to the person at the top.
Right. Yeah, that certainly is the same in sports and in economics. Yes, I agree.
It's there is a certain romance we have. My colleague Dan Klein calls it the people's romance. That government in general can help us, but I think it's more than that. I really think it is the top down. I think it probably. I'm going to throw out a horrible theory here, but I'm just going to say it anyway. I think it starts in the womb. In the womb, you're kind of reliant on a top-down process, and it lasts for a long time, right? It's a huge portion of your life. It can be, at current lifespans, it's roughly 15 to 20% is spent dependent on others, and so it's very hard for us to think that salvation could come from ourselves or a different process rather than just top-down.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons why we tend to favor top-down things. We also, we want to we see a tragic problem, and we want to know, the exact course of action that will solve the problem. And the top-down people are happy to tell you what that course of action is, even though they have no evidence and a miserable track record.
The curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. My favorite Hayek quote, and those of you out there in the pool, it's roughly
one of my favorites. We're
about 38 minutes into the podcast before it got mentioned. You actually have a quote from Kenneth Arrow that's quite similar that I'd never heard before. You have that handy in the paper?
Yes, let me just look it up on the iPad while we continue talking. It's, Arrow also had, and Arrow, of course, we think of as not being in the same ideological place as Hayek. And, of course, Hayek, I think, is very unfairly treated and being sort of ideologically boxed in when he really spans a lot of different ideological camps.
Yeah, sometimes he gets called a conservative.
Right.
Sometimes he's called the father of the welfare state because he once wrote that health insurance might be a good idea. So that means that anything done in the area of entitlements is fine because Hayek said so. It's a strange conclusion to leap to.
Right. I mean, the idea of spontaneous order, nowadays has much more appeal across the whole political spectrum than it did when Hayek was writing, because we have the internet.
Yeah.
Just sort of giving us a huge example of spontaneous order. There was a wonderful economist who told a story about an investor who went to France in the early days of the internet, and he was selling an internet-based company, and the French investors wanted to know, well, who's the president of the internet? Mm-hmm. And he said, there is no president. The internet is just this bottom-up, self-organizing thing, and the French thought he was completely crazy, and it was clear they were not going to invest with him if he was peddling such a crazy idea. So, in the end, he told them that he was president of the internet, and he got the investors to invest.
Is this an apocryphal story, Bill? It sounds.
I think it's in Paul Seabright's book.
It reminds me of that visiting Chinese communists or Russian communist story about who's in charge of whatever it was, and
right.
I remember that one, but it's a good one also. But I wonder if they probably are both true, actually, instead of both being false.
Right.
Anyway, any luck with that arrow quote?
My iPad is slow, actually, but
okay.
I think I'm almost there. Yep, here we go. I've got it. Okay, so here's the arrow quote. The notion that through the workings of an entire system, effects may be very different from and even opposed to intentions is surely the most important intellectual contribution that economic thought has made to the general understanding of social processes.
Yeah, it's a great quote. I believe I have said that last part myself, but it's nice to hear that Kenneth Arrow agrees. It makes me happy. Now, you have just if you were a listener to this podcast and you hadn't heard much else about growth, we're talking to Bill Easterly. He's a leading authority. Arguably the leading authority on economic growth. There might be some people who disagree with that, but everybody would put him in the top 10, maybe the top 5, maybe the top 3, even if you don't like what he says. And here he is telling us that we really don't have any clue. We've got Bill Easterly saying this. We've got the 200-person Growth Commission of the World Bank saying it. We really don't understand the processes that lead to growth, and we certainly don't understand the role that political institutions play in growth, although we might occasionally want it to be otherwise. And yet, you just finished teaching a class on growth this semester, graduate course. Mm-hmm. What do we know other than that we don't know what we'd like to know? What is there to say other than all the main theories are wrong? Is there anything positive that we can conclude? I'm looking for a little uplift here.
Yes.
Or knowledge, either one.
Happy to supply some uplift
at
the end. So, of course, we don't have the luxury of not choosing. We have to choose. There are alternative camps, alternative viewpoints. Should we do central planning? Should we do free market? Should we do government picking winners, industrial policy, or should we let the market pick the winners? And so, in the end, we have to choose. And, I think Hayek's, one of the reasons I like Hayek is that his insight was, and in a way, Hayek predicted this growth ignorance that has now become so visible in economics. Because he said, that growth is about innovation. It's about the emergence of what we want when we see it. We don't even know ahead of time what we're going to want through the independent and competitive efforts of many. And Hayek is using our lack of knowledge as the best possible argument for a decentralized market system. That if there is no central authority who knows what to do to raise the growth rate, then let the decentralized market system find the new innovations that will lead to economic success. That's Hayek's big insight, and of course we know it very well in the form of the invisible hand for private goods in the free market, but I think it also applies to more generally society and individual liberty. If we, let's not give a lot of power to any centralized authorities because they don't have any expert knowledge on which they can make growth go up or down. Let's leave things to the spontaneous efforts of not only private market suppliers and businesses and entrepreneurs, but also social entrepreneurs and political entrepreneurs under a system of liberty in which, you get rewarded positively for things that have a social return and you get penalized for things that have a negative social return.
Well, this past Sunday, in the New York Times Book Review, Francis Fukuyama reviewed the new edition of the Constitution of Liberty, and Fukuyama made the claim that Hayek is not Hayekian, which is quite a claim. But his claim, which is an interesting argument, is that along the lines you just said, well, there's trial and error. People do the best they can, and they stumble toward stuff because they don't have the cookbook or the manual. And the way I read Fukuyama's critique in this section of his review was that, well, governments can do the same thing. They can lurch forward, and sometimes they lurch forward successfully, and they find good policies, and sometimes they fail, and they can learn the way on. They can be entrepreneurial. That's the way I took his critique of Hayek's defense of market process. And you disagreed. Why?
Yeah. I mean, what he's totally missing is that if we're talking about a centralized government trying to achieve a whole society-wide outcome, then that kind of knowledge of governments what to do simply does not exist. Whereas the kind of knowledge that Hayek was saying does exist is the kind of dispersed local knowledge which people have the incentive in a decentralized system of liberty. They have the incentive to apply their local knowledge to solving local problems. And that kind of problem-solving system works when there is no reliable centralized knowledge about what the society can do, but there's lots of useful localized knowledge. Then the system you want to go for is the system that relies on individual liberty and lets people, get rewarded for their contributions to society, and also has the flip side of penalizing them for anything negative they do to society. Those are the rules of individual liberty.
Couldn't we incentivize bureaucrats to be more successful?
Good luck with that. I think there is, of course, there is a role for government. That's another caricature that people throw at Hayek and other similar-minded people that, no role for government. But of course there's a role for government. Of course there are public goods. And yes, there are feedback and accountability systems in a free society based on individual liberty, where any politician who does a really lousy job supplying public goods has to answer to voters. I think that tends to work somewhat better at the decentralized municipal level more than it does at the national level. But
have you ever lived in Chicago? No.
Okay. Maybe in small towns.
You got a small data set there.
Maybe in suburbs of Chicago.
Yeah, there you got a better shot.
But yes, the democratic feedback mechanisms could make possible some system of innovation and trial and error. In fact, they have. Some of the great successes in public goods, like cleaning up municipal water supplies. I think those happen because of democratic feedback mechanisms. But it is a much cruder mechanism than the market mechanism. So you don't want to turn over the whole market economy to the government, because you're substituting a very crude, badly calibrated feedback system in democracy for a very finely calibrated system in a market feedback, decentralized free market feedback system.
I was joking a minute ago about Chicago, but let me make a serious comment along those lines and get your reaction. There is a general assumption, a presumption, I should say. There's a presumption that municipal local control works more effectively than national control, and that you should therefore decentralize, even to the extent you can, the provision of public goods to local areas to local authorities where there's, in theory, more control. I think there's less control potentially in local areas. I understand the presumption, but it seems to me, and this to me plays into the cognitive bias part in a maybe hypothetical. I'm just, again, speculating here, but I hadn't thought about it. It's quite interesting. Most people don't pay any attention to their local elections. They don't pay much attention to local outcomes. I live in Montgomery County in Maryland. We have it's hard to believe, but we have a monopoly on taxi services. If you want to drive a cab in Montgomery County, you have to be, I know the name, I'm not going to say it, but you have to be a member of this company, and that company, strangely enough, gives a lot of money to the head of the county council. Now, I know that.
Right.
Do most of my fellow Montgomery County citizens know it? I don't think they do, and part of the reason, and it might not matter either way, it's a little taste of autocracy in our. It's more efficient. There's only one. You don't have to wasteful competition. Strangely enough, they're often late. But my argument is that there's no glory. There's not much glory in local politics, and so we don't spend a lot of time fascinated by the county council or the head of the county government. We spend a lot of time fascinated by the president, who's going to run against him. We invest our hopes and dreams in this. The more top down, the better, because the more power they'll have. But these local guys, who's paying attention? And the answer is not too many, and so they can get away with a lot.
Well, I think I hear what you're saying, and I agree with those examples of democratic failure. But I think there's another bias that we have, that we put too much emphasis on the elections component of democracy, and we forget all the other things that can go on in a democracy. So anything that people really do care about. I mean, I used to live in Montgomery County. I lived in Tacoma Park, which was a particularly vigorous activist community.
Yep.
And my personal favorite example is that I one day picked up the phone and called my city councilwoman, Kathy Porter, who later became mayor of Tacoma Park, and I said, "Hey, Kathy, I have this gigantic pothole outside of my house." And the next day, Tacoma Park Public Works came by and filled the pothole. And that's the kind of thing that I think
that's true.
We're ignoring when we obsess about elections. I think there's anything that citizens really do care an awful lot about, they are going to find a way in a democratic system to get heard. And there is lobbying, and there are all these ways that you can get heard to fix anything that you really do care an awful lot about, and that's not reflected at all in the fixation on elections that we have with our usual analyses of democracy.
Yeah, it's a great point. In John Mueller's book, Capitalism and Democracy, and Ralph's Pretty Good Grocery, I think he was talking, the book was written, I want to say in the 90s, he was talking about Mexico, and he said, the PRI party wins every year, every election, so Mexico's a dictatorship, really. It's not really much of a democracy, but that's really only on election day. The other 364 days a year, there's a lot of political forces pushing that party in particular directions if they want to stay in power, and we've neglected that point. Let's close with that. We've accepted through most of this conversation that there is such a thing as an autocrat. But of course, my favorite counterexample is that Adolf Hitler, in the middle of I think it was the middle of the war, a bunch of German housewives protested in Berlin against the treatment. Either they had Jewish husbands, I can't remember what it was, and they got their way. He didn't just say, "Hey, I'm the dictator. I do whatever I want." Even Stalin and Hitler and Mao couldn't do, quote, whatever they want. They could do a lot of things that they wanted that were horrifyingly tragic and destructive, but they have political forces, whether it's within the army, whether it's within the populace. There is political capital that those people have to shepherd, even when they're autocrats, what we call autocrats.
Right. Yeah, I think that's the other big flaw in the benevolent autocrat theory, is that we have this incredibly simplistic idea that the autocrats desire high growth, and then they are totally unconstrained in being able to reach high growth. When really what's going on under autocracy is there's like strategic interaction. There's a big game being played between all the players, only one of whom is the autocratic leader. And there's potential, revolutionaries and demonstrators and elite power holders, and there's this complicated game and the military, and the outcomes are also often unintentional. The difference between the unintentional autocracy and the unintentional market is that there's no mechanism in autocracy to make sure the unintentional outcome is a good one.
Huh.
So the unintentional outcomes can often be, disastrous outcomes.
You reference in the paper. You reference the work of Bruce Bueno de Mesquita, your colleague at NYU, who you've interviewed about his work on this. He talks about the selectorate, the people who have control over who's going to be the leader, and they obviously wield a lot of power.
Right.
And once there's a lot of them, you start to get into a question of what they want, as if that was a single thing, and they don't want a single thing.
Right.
And that is an emergent process as well.
Right.
A minute ago, when I asked you about what we know, you took a Hayekian route.
Right.
I'm sure I'd enjoy being a student in your class. But if I were a student in someone else's class, perhaps at your university or perhaps at a different one, they get a different story. Maybe less agnostic than you are about most things. Do you think there's a consensus? At the beginning of our conversation, you suggested almost that I think you suggested literally there was a consensus that we don't know anything. Do you think that is the consensus in the academic field called development economics? With now a lot of romance about experiments, maybe, but
I confess that I have a little bit of a weakness for overdoing this ignorance point, because I get confronted with so many people who have so much excessive confidence in how much we do know. But the reality is, of course, it's not total ignorance. What is the field? Development economics is just economics. It's just what do we know as economists? We do know a lot of things that work in the long run, even though we can't reliably predict that they will give you a 6% growth rate next year. We do know that if you take advantage of good economics, you will do well in the long run. If you realize gains from trade, gains from specialization, comparative advantage, all these principles, these are ways in which you can get a lot out of a little. And what is the system that does that? It's a market system that lets people trade and specialize and realize their own comparative advantage. So, I'm not really saying that economics is useless. Far from it. I'm saying, what we don't have is a kind of specialized the kind of specialized centralized knowledge that would allow some central authority to achieve a given society-wide outcome. But what we do have is a set of principles, which are basically the principles that tell us how individual liberty is going to work out. If you design institutions to allow individual liberty to flourish, then the reason that individual liberty leads pragmatically to prosperity in the long run are all of these principles of gains from trade and gains from specialization and all of that we have learned, from kindergarten in economics. That economics does still work. I'm a firm believer in that.
But how we get there from here is that the tricky part? Why is the Washington consensus not a consensus anymore?
Well, I think that there's confusion between principles and application. I think the principles we're very clear about. And I think there's even a consensus within a lot of economists about those principles, even though there's some, there's differing views on the extent of say, government action or something. There's actually pretty wide consensus among economists. And actually the original Washington consensus, if you just took it as a set of principles, it's very innocuous. I mean, it'd be hard to imagine that you could get many people to disagree with the principles that are in the Washington consensus about, don't have gigantic government deficits and debt, don't have super high inflation, let markets set the prices mostly. You don't have any kind of gross interference in markets.
Rule of law is a good idea. Private property works.
Right. So I think the reason that it failed as a Washington consensus is what was implied in those words, Washington consensus. There was some elite group in Washington that was going to impose these not as principles, but they were going to decide the practical applications of these principles through IMF and World Bank loans in Bolivia and Ecuador and Zambia and Zimbabwe and Philippines, and then there was sort of this xenophobic populist backlash against these foreign experts who frankly did not really know enough about these economies to know how to apply these principles to these economies. I think that's why the Washington consensus failed. It's in the application stage, not as principles.
So you don't think when I think about it, I think of it more of as an interaction problem, that there's culture, there's institutions, and then there's these principles. If you just apply the principles without the other two, the culture and the institutions, they don't work very well. So if the
principles certainly have to include the institutional rules that make markets work, and culture plays a role in supporting those institutional rules. That if you have a culture that promotes kind of individual responsibility and trustworthiness, that kind of supports the institutional rules that can be also formalized legally to support contracts that you need to be able to enforce in order to realize gains from trade. So that's the underpinning of the principles that you need to make them operational. But it still comes down to just, economists do. I think we have spent 200 years since Adam Smith, kind of honing this body of knowledge, which still is a very useful body of knowledge about what are the principles of prosperity.
So if you were in charge of, if you were in Zimbabwe and Mr. Mugabe took a real liking to you and thought you were a swell fellow and seemed to be, he'd always liked NYU, and he thought the cover of your last book was really nice, and he says, "So tell me one thing to do here." So this is a serious question. I'm joking about the Mugabe part.
No, I know it's a serious question.
The serious question
is the question that I used to be asked all the time at the World Bank.
Can you do something productive? We've talked about the pretense of knowledge and how little we know.
Right.
Could you comfortably and confidently make suggestions for that economy at the margin, or would you find that to be an unbearable situation?
Well, the first thing I would tell them is, don't hire some, white guy from NYU who knows nothing about Zimbabwe. Hire, some seasoned politicians with something at stake in the game of policy reform to implement the policy. And in fact, even as terrible as the Mugabe government is, there is this finance minister, actually, I had the honor of meeting at NYU recently, who did successfully bring down the hyperinflation, eliminated the hyperinflation in Zimbabwe through standard monetarist.
Yeah, stop printing money would be...
Stop printing money.
That would be my first...
introduce the dollar as a means of exchange and get rid of the domestic currency. That did the trick, getting rid of inflation. And I think it worked much better because an insider did it than it would have worked as a coercive outsider coming in and doing it.
And would you continue down that path of suggestions? Would you have more to suggest?
Yeah, I think the suggestions are always just going to be, get local people who know how to play the political game of actually making things happen in this society and know what the relevant institutions and political constraints are in this society, and then have them apply good economics to the society. I think the act of economic reform, the art of economic reform is really figuring out a way in which you apply Econ 101 to local conditions, where you have to have someone who's very knowledgeable of local conditions.
My guest today has been William Easterly. Bill, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
My pleasure, Russ. Take care.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.